Tonight's featured demonstrator, we're happy to announce, is John Giem. John, you've heard all about him tonight, and tonight you're going to see a little bit of action from him as well. John, if you would, if you're ready, we're ready for you, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're going to be demonstrating for tonight.
Well, I was talking with Raleigh a couple months ago about doing a demo. We were searching around a little bit. It turns out that I had done some work on inside-out turnings several years ago. And I started digging through and found some of the stuff that I had done. And I decided, well, it's time to dig it out, polish it up, and see what we can do, see if we can make something interesting. And so this is one of them I had that I showed him, and he thought that'd be interesting. And I tried duplicating it. Of course, not quite the same, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. I did some research on the internet with American Woodturner, and most of the articles, or in fact all the articles I saw in there, used 4 segments for their turnings. And the stuff that I had in my scrap box was all 3 segments. So I started playing around with it and doing both of them. And I encourage you to try it. And once you get the idea of what's going on, remember, if you're going to refine your skill, you got to do about 10 or 12 of them before you really understand what's going on and you say that you can do it on a regular basis. So I'm going to be doing I like to use the 3 staves. For some reason or other, I like that a little bit better. It's a little bit of a challenge because you've got trapezoidal, and you need to get them such that the joint is fairly good. So you want the joints fairly good. You want them to be tight. And when you get through, you're going to turn them 180 like that, and what was on the inside is on the outside. That's why we call it inside-out turning. So we're going to turn them twice. And there's several things that I have learned in doing a bunch of these that make it a little bit easier to do. So part of what I'm going to be doing tonight is showing you what makes it easier to do to get your results good. First of all, you have to have all 3 segments the same length, and you want to be able to get them in there good and tight. Now, to give you an idea of what they look like, you can do either 3 segments or 4 segments. I got both. And I've passed this around to give you an idea of what they look like and how I fasten them together. Now, the original stuff that I did several years ago, we put them together and glued them together on the ends only. And I used, I believe the typical way of doing it is using brown paper bag and the glue joint. That makes it a weak glue joint, but it holds together. And then when you get through, you take a chisel and you split them apart and hope they don't break. I've refined it a little bit since then. So what I do now is I'll take tape and put on there. Well, I'll start with using rubber band. And put tape around there to hold it together. Now, the square one that you see running around there right now, you'll notice that on the corners, I've got some pieces of angle iron in there to protect, not angle iron, it's aluminum, to protect the corners a little bit. But I don't find that's quite as critical on these guys. So I tape them together with rubber bands and such and get them in position, and then use hose clamps. Now, depending upon the hose clamps you got, they may or may not reach all the way around, so don't be afraid to take 2 of them and link them together. In doing a lot of these things, I wind up using my drill to pull them together. And it's nice to have a clutch on there so that you don't over tighten them. And these clamps are good enough that I don't have to worry too much about them coming apart while I'm turning them. See, I linked two of them together on this one. Okay. So now I've got a piece that I can put on the lathe. Now, if I'm going to put this on the lathe, well, that's kind of scary. Turn it around so it goes the other direction. And we'll put tape on it to boot to protect it. I don't need the rubber bands anymore. Is that the way to put it on there? No. Let's turn it around. Now I'm using stab centers on here because they're spring loaded. And I'm going to put in the middle. Well, wait a minute. I got a problem here. That isn't very flat, is it? That's better. So we can straighten those things out and make them uniform. Now, the other thing is we want the center. Now, we can see the center. That's where those joints get together. But it's not always easy to hit the center point there. So what we do when we have our blanks, before we ever assemble it, you take your blank and just run it across a piece of sandpaper. And that way, when you reassemble it, you do it on all four pieces. And that way, when you reassemble it, you got a divot in there for your centerpiece to go in. So little things like that make a difference. Just hit each one of those corners a little bit before you assemble it. It makes it easier. And that's what I've already done on these. That center point's located in there. And I don't like that thing flipping out there, so just take a piece of tape, stick on it. I use a lot of this painter's tape on this stuff. And use several layers. Now, when we did our design of what we're going to make, we had to figure out what we're going to do with this thing, because looking at it, if we're going to make one of these things, we got to figure out what the inside is going to look like, because what's on the inside is now going to be on the outside over here. So I've sat down and did some drawing, and wherever I did with it, there it is. I made a template that approximates what I'm going to cut. Would you have guessed that? That's what I'm going to make. That's the cavity I'm going to try to make in there. So you got to stop and think about what you're going to do. Now, as far as making a template like this, what do you guys use when you make these templates that you're going to make? I don't like cardboard. Doesn't last. Do any of you get any of these advertising magnets that go in the refrigerator? They're fairly rigid. They're easy to cut with an X-Acto knife or scissors. And I was trying to make some Christmas trees. Now, I was experimenting around with these things, and I won't tell you which were the first and which is the last I made. I won't tell you whether I liked them or disliked them. But I brought my granddaughter out to my shop, and I asked her, what do you think of them? And she's in her mid-20s, so she's intelligent. She liked all three of them. So it's a matter of opinion as to what you like. But make your templates as to what you're going to be making cavity out of there. Okay, now that does not have an end sticking out on it, so we're not in too bad a shape there. Okay. So to make this, I'm going to cut in there, and my initial cut is going to be right about there. And I will draw that around so I can see it when the light's in this great light we've got when I got the lathe running. So that's a cut that I'm going to make in there. Okay. And I need to know how deep I'm going to cut it. Somewhere around here I got a pair of I won't use it. Oh, there it is. I put it where it's supposed to be. Now, from previous design, I know that I want going to cut in, and I want about a 3/4 inch diameter for this particular design. So I'm going to set this at 3/4 of an inch and lock it in place. And I'm going to use my parting tool and cut in there. Now, if I'm going to use this, you see anything unique about this? What? I rounded the corners, didn't I? Now, this is a cheap pair of verniers. If I get the good ones out here, got nice sharp corners. If I tried to use this one on that when it's running, that was going to dig in. They're going to cause problems. I don't want that. So round the corners off of anything you're going to run in there. And I'm going to see if I can keep the shavings from going down the neck. And where did I put that faceplate? There it is. Now at home I've got a full-fledged helmet with air filtration and everything, but if I put that on here, the noise from the air filter, the motor, would drown out the microphone. So I don't think you want that noise. Now another thing, wow. You get Dave? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to use an 1/8 inch wide or 1/4 inch wide parting tool. And using that 1/4 inch parting tool, I can use this safely. Now, if I used a thin parting tool, don't use this while it's running, because that thin kerf will grab this thing and throw it at you. Don't ask me how I know. Okay? Now, I like to have a magnet up here, kind of hold things in place, keep stuff from getting lost. Okay, let's turn this thing on, get out of the line of fire. That's running about 1800. I'm going to slow it down a little bit. Now remember, a parting tool like this, you can use it as a cutter or you can use it as a scraper. You could use it as a cutter when you're working with spindle turning like this, because the grain is running this way. If you're using faceplate turning like a bowl gouge or a bowl, you don't want to use it as a cutter. You know why? Very much you want to use it as a cutter on a bowl. What? You're going to have that end grain come around, it's going to grab it, and it threw my tool across the shop. That was one of the early learning curves. So if you're using these on a cross grain or bowl gouge, on a bowl with the grain is running perpendicular to the axis of rotation, you use it as a scraper only. Okay. That's going to establish the wall thickness on this piece right in here. Because that's going to be the outside, that what's in the inside now is going to be the outside later. So that's going to fit in there. Oh, just my pencil. Okay, so that's going to fit in there, something like that. And so I'm going to start trying to make a little taper from here and going down. You know, remember, you touch and lift your tool. And remember, the smoother you make this cut, less sanding you'll have to do later. And this is approximate, it's not exact, but it gives me a pretty good idea of what I need to do. Okay, now, one of the challenges I had when I was starting to do this the first time, I had a crazy design that had an undercut there. And I had a hard time figuring out how I was going to do it. I tried using a nice little spindle gouge, cutting in there, and finally I gave up and went over and got a hollowing tool. That way I can get in there and shape that out. But I don't have quite enough shoulder space here, so I'm going to smooth that out a little bit more. But There are several different designs of hollowing tools that you can use. When you're doing things like this, as you all know at this point, you've been around a while, you always look at the horizon. If you look at the end of your cutting tool, you're not going to get as much information as if you look at the horizon. Now, as a reminder on your hollowing tools, if I put this thing up there like that, it would have a lot of torque on it. But if I move my tool rest out, and I'm on this shaft, that's in line with the cutting tip. So I don't have much torque. It's in line with, the force is in line with the handle. So I can have a little better control that way. Unfortunately, it's further out. I tried using some of these little small hollowing tools that I had purchased that for hollowing out miniatures. They weren't working for me. They had a tendency to, the tool had a tendency to twist within the handle itself. So I reverted back to, I think this was made by Trent Bosch. So this is what I wound up using. Let's see how good a job I can do with it. Now, while I'm doing this, if you think about it, how's this going to show up in the final piece that we turn? You're going to see this cut edge, but where is it going to be? Can you visualize it? See, this is, I don't know if you can see this there, Dave, or not, but if you lay this down there, try to line up the this edge with roughly the center line. This surface right here is going to be that surface right there. See it? Got to warp your mind around a little bit. So this surface here is going to be this surface right here. Any questions so far? Got everybody confused? What was that, Chris? Yeah, it does. The biggest challenge I had was trying to figure out the design and the dimensions that I wanted to make. How thick do I make this part right here? How thick do I make that? And I actually sat down and had to draw it out, make a scale drawing, and make it as accurate as possible so I could measure it. Now we can sand this a little bit at this point. Now remember, when you sand stuff on the lathe, you want to slow it down. Remember why? What's that? Well, if you sand, does wood have moisture in it? Okay, and if you get the wood hot, what happens? It cracks it, right? So you want to slow it down so you can get that. I'm not going to sand this completely because you've got better things to do than sit there watching me sand. There's more interesting parts of it. That gets that part of it. Then the other challenge is how do we sand the inside of that curve? Well, I dug around in my toolbox, and those of you who've been to my shop, I think that most of you will agree that I am a toolaholic. And I've got all sorts of stuff in that shop. I found these crazy things. I'm not sure where I got them, but they work. It's just sandpaper wrapped around the mandrel. So I can turn the thing on, and while it's running, I take that sands that out. Any questions so far? Harry, you're shaking your head back and forth. Either you don't have any questions or you don't believe me. Which is it? Okay. Okay. Now, at this point, that's good enough for now. We're going to get to the more interesting stuff. Don't rip things apart here. Now, if you remember, this thing's still working okay?
Yes.
If you remember, I was real careful to make sure that these things are pretty close to lined up flat. And there's a reason for that. Because that helps us keep the inside, when we turn it around, it keeps things lined up. Okay. So, let's take the masking tape off. What's that?
When you just hung up, is it possible to pass it around and let everybody see it? Is that too technical? Whatever, so yours, not mine. Be nice to
Now, let me point something out to you real quick. I made a mistake when I put these on. I got one going that way, one going that way. I should have had both go in the same direction. Now, it turns out that this one does not have a big flap on it, so I got by with it. If that one had a long flap on it like this, I'd had to take it apart and put it back together. Okay. Now, let's get our drill together. Now, you don't have to use a drill to operate these things, but I find it's a lot faster. But you got to be careful because that drill has a lot of torque, and it can really surprise you. Okay, now I've got these labeled.
John, we have a
ABC.
question.
Say again?
I was just going to give a quick tip that I do. While instead of using the pipe or the clamp things, what I do is actually, when I prep my blank that I'm going to do, I leave an inch on each end, and then I glue only a half an inch on each end so that it's, it's glued and I don't have to use any clamp that way. I can then, I have that inch that I kind of make as a no man's land kind of thing. And when I'm done, then I just cut off that ½ inch on each side that I glued. And so then everything just pops right apart, but I still have the remaining ½ inch on each side as a reference point, so I can flip around and get everything back.
So you basically cut off the glued sections on each end.
Yeah, and that way you don't have to use any clamps at all. You still have a reference section for flipping around.
Well,
it's much safer. And you can always, too, if you're worried about, ½ inch not being enough glue to hold a bigger piece, you can always extend to that, at a half or more of whatever you want to give yourself space. But that way it is kind of nice that you don't have to worry while turning.
If I did that, I'd cut off my markings. I got to have these markings so I can keep track.
There's markings on the end. You mark it in your no man land kind of thing, so that you're glued when you're cut off. You still have your markings. There's on your reference section.
Well,
instead.
and when I first did this, and some of the stuff that's in the literature, they put the paper in the glue joint. Then you take a chisel and you split it. That's the way I did it the first time. There's an elaborate process in the American Woodturner where they has some fancy face plates and clamps around it to clamp it in place. There's a dozen ways to do it. There is no, if you don't get injured, if you don't contaminate your floor with that red stuff, then you're okay. When you contaminate the floor with that red stuff, then you did something wrong. And if think of it also, wood is cheap. Wood is cheap. I don't have any money invested in this wood, but all these other stuff, I got lots of money invested in that. So I'm willing to experiment. This is experimented here with just pine. My granddaughter likes it. I won't tell you my opinion of it, but my way of thinking is different than hers. Okay, so you notice I got the ABC, and it looks like that. Now I take that and rotate that 180, rotate that 180. Now is it starting to look more like what you saw up here? That's starting to look better? Okay, now, here's some ways of saving yourself some time and energy because we got to glue this stuff together. So, we'll start off by putting rubber bands around it. And several years ago, I took a course up at Sears Trostel in making wooden boxes. And I learned some things in making wooden boxes that I'm going to use here. So I'm going to start by putting tape all the way around it, because this is the position I want the stuff when I'm finished, right? What's that?
Is it flat?
It's not quite flat enough, is it? That not being flat on the bottom translates into an offset in here. So I really want that flat. That's better. Everybody's got one of these, right? Everybody made one of these, one of their first projects. Jenny, how long did it take you to make one?
30 minutes.
But I had a lot of gluing to do because of all the funky
Okay.
wood.
Now, we've got it in roughly the position we want, got taped together. Now I'm going to take my knife and I'm going to find one of the seams. Let's find the seam between A and B. And I'm going to cut the tape. Okay? Take the rubber bands off. Oh, it's already waiting for us to sand it or to glue it together. There it is. Now, when you're gluing stuff up, you really don't want to glue squeeze out in critical areas. Where are the critical areas? Well, right along in here, because this is going to be on the inside. That's going to be where you're going to show. So I'm going to put the glue on there and start in that area and go away from it. Now, I don't care if we have squeeze out up in those areas. Whose table am I messing up here?
It's a club table, so no worries.
Okay, this one doesn't have any glue on it. Now, theoretically, I could use CA glue with this, and it would set up for me in a few minutes, and we could go ahead and turn it. But experience is that that's a short-term solution, long-term failure. I don't like to use CA glue for anything I want to use long-term. Now, one of these guys here I did with CA glue, and it got along all right. Okay. Now, all we have to do is fold it up. If I did it right, we got glue on all the surfaces. Put the rubber bands on there to hold it in place while we put the clamps on. Okay, and we put our fingers on there, we push the things, get these outside surfaces lined up so the inside surfaces do good. Time it doesn't make any difference which way we put the clamps on there because we're going to take them off after the glue dries and before we start turning. Now, there's a little bit of glue squeeze out in there, but I found that doesn't make a difference. If you let it dry, then go in there with an X-Acto knife. It's fairly easy to clean up. So now, that is a lot friendlier than using the old nut driver. But I will have to admit that I have broken these things. Any questions so far? Okay. I'm going to use the magic time machine and walk over here and go zap. It's dry, and bring it back out. So that's what we have after it's dried. Now, do you recognize that in there was that initial dimension that we measured with this guy? So that space there was the diameter of that thin spot. So that was backed up against this piece here, which backed up against that, and that made that central core. So that was real critical. That's probably the most critical part of it. If that didn't have enough thickness there, then you wouldn't have anything to work with. And when I was playing around with these guys over here, that was one of the problems I had, in that I did not leave that center part thick enough. So these parts out here became so thin that I couldn't make this round. So this is the first one I did. And then I went back and tried this one, and I made a little bit more progress, and then I went back to this one and got closer to what I wanted. So don't be afraid to experiment. That's just cheap pine. There's nothing sacred about it. You can do anything with it you want. Any questions so far? Am I going too fast? Yeah.
John, if you left that 3/4 bigger, okay, and then swapped them out, you could cut the outside to make it that outside post smaller, right? Does that make sense?
Well, turns out I can take this. I give you kind of explain that to you. This one, these are 4 pieces. This one, when I turned it, I didn't leave that inside thick enough. So when I started turning this, if I made this part here round like I wanted, I wouldn't have anything left here. So on this one, I made that inside diameter thicker, and that allowed me to make this completely round. So that was my learning experience. Hopefully you can learn from my learning experience. Another way of looking at it is my mistakes, I learn from them, and you can learn from my mistakes. Incidentally, how many of you figured out where the mistakes that I made on these guys over here? I see one hand. Think about it. We'll talk about it when I get through with this. Okay. Now that our glue is set up, I will put this back on the lathe and made a mistake. Remember I said that when you start off, you should take your blanks and rub the corners on a piece of sandpaper so that you have your center well marked. Well, that gives you a nice divot. Well, I didn't do that very well on this one, so I've got to go in there and do it by hand.
So, John, you did it on one side but not the other? Is that
What's
what
that?
happened? You did it on one side but not the other, so when it inside out it? Because you have to do both sides, right?
Yeah,
Because
that makes a difference,
The
doesn't it?
outside becomes the inside.
You got to do it on both inside and the outside before you assemble it, and on both ends. Now, what I'm going to do with this, I'm going to put it in here and put it in the lathe, and I'm going to turn this down and make a 1-inch tenon on this end, because the chuck that I've got, this is the chuck I'm using. These are straight jaws, they're not dovetail. So I can make a 1-inch diameter tenon any length that I want, whatever's convenient. I'm going to make it long enough that it can support this while I turn the rest of it. Questions? Yeah.
What about a plain finish before you turn it around? So your inside is finished.
For those on Zoom, the question was, what about applying a finish on the inside first before you turn it around?
You could. There's no reason why you couldn't. It's a matter of style. Depending on what kind of finish you're going to use and so forth. Now, these guys here, the ones that have a finish on them, I used a spray can. Use spray finish. And what I did is I learned a long time ago that if you have something that you're spraying and you're supporting it, if you support it with a bunch of little points, it doesn't show up later. If you just lay it on a flat piece of table, it's going to stick someplace. So I took my board and it had a air-operated pneumatic nailer and about 1-inch nails, and I drove them all the way through. So just at random, so I wound up with a board with these nails sticking up. And that allows me to lay those things on there and spray them, and then turn them a little bit, spray them again, and it worked out pretty good. Again, depends on what your finish is you want to use. Now, most of the bowls and other turnings that I bake, I use tung oil finish, which is an entirely different type of finish anyway. But yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't put a friction finish or something like that on the inside. And that would actually have some advantage, because if you have some glue, so you can see, if you can see it, there's a little bit of squeeze out of glue right in there. And I can take an X-Acto knife and get that out of there without any trouble. But if you have a nice finish on it, the glue won't stick to it. So it'll make it easier to clean up. There's no one way to do anything. There's multiple ways of doing it. I've heard it said that if you can only think of one way to doing something, you're not thinking hard enough. Another way of looking at it, if you're never making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. You're not learning anything. If you don't make any mistakes, then you're not pushing your skills far enough. And I'll be honest with you, when I made this, which one was it? When I did this one, I left that center, that first cut, I left it too thin. So then I did not have enough room to make this thing round the way I wanted. So the later ones, I made it thicker, and then I had enough room to make it round. There. My granddaughter likes these things. That's great. It doesn't. I'm liking it better, but there's still some room for improvement. Like I was telling somebody else earlier today, if you can get your spouse to recognize the value of what you're doing, she will be a lot happier and you will be a lot happier. Okay, what do I do with my verniers? I'm going to set these to 1 inch. Now there's a difference in the dividers that I've got on here that point out to you. This is a normal parting tool you're used to. That's got a straight edge, and it leaves a little bit of a rough surface when it cuts. This one's a little bit different. You might want to look at it when we're through. The top surface here is concave, very thin, but it's concave. So when you're cutting, it cuts the side fibers first instead of tearing it out. So it makes a smoother cut, but yet it's thin enough I can't use my calipers on it. It has a tendency to grab my tool if I do that. So let's cut this thing down. And I'll use my precision eyeball. Now, a lot of people do not make any precision measurement on this. And with this particular dimension, it's not critical. That other dimension, when I was doing the inside, was critical. This is apple, by the way. How many of you have turned very many finials? Anybody? Okay, now when you're turning finials, one of the things that you learn is that you start on the outside and work back, because as you remove wood, it becomes fragile down here. If you start at this end and work that way, then this will be too fragile to do anything with. So that's what we've got to do here, is we got to pretend this thing is sort of like a finial. And so I will start turning at this end and work my way back. It helps if I turn the chucks correct direction. And some of these pieces are going to get real thin. And if you have a sharp tool and you're careful, it's not a problem. But again, it takes practice. And like we said before, you got to look at the horizon. If you're looking at the end of the tool, you can't see what's going on. If you look at the horizon, you can get a better feel. Have you got your minds oriented now? You figured out where that came from? Have you figured out that when I went through the magic drying process, that when I dried my glue, that this shape changed just a little bit. Nobody saw that, right? Dave's not going to do a comparison on the machine there. Bowl gouge. I use a bowl gouge quite a bit. I'm familiar with it. It allows me to do some do some nice things, and I will do the final turning on this with a spindle gouge because it says spindle turning. But I'm also using the bowl gouge quite a bit instead of roughing gouge. It's beginning to look more like what you expected. Now I've got a lot to take off here, so I'm going to start working on that. I'll stop periodically so you can see it taking shape. Now you notice I'm using the wing of the bowl gouge. And I'm kind of using it as a planer. See how these things are coming off? That gives us a nice smooth curve, nice smooth cut. When you become proficient with the bowl gouge, there's about 5, 6, maybe 7 different cuts you can make with it. Okay, now I'm going to switch over to the spindle gouge and make sure I know where I'm at. So I got quite a bit of wood to take off the shoulder yet. You touch the heel and raise chisel until he starts cutting. How many turners do we have here that are right-handed turners? How many left-handed? How many could do both? Those of you who aren't familiar with left-handed, this is doing right-handed, this is doing left-handed. I suggest that you learn how to do both. I learned it by accident because I was doing some turning and the shavings were throwing in my face. So I just started doing it left-handed and they went over my shoulder. So that's one of the things that happened when I first started out, didn't know the difference. And depending upon what you're cutting and when you're cutting it, sometimes you want to use left-handed turning because it allows you to get to it. If you're doing right-handed turning, your body gets rather awkward. Now, you notice that we're starting to creep up on here. When we get finished, this turn surface will intersect with this edge all the way around. We're not there yet. Got a long ways to go, but it will start to intersect. And what is now about 3/8 of an inch thick will turn out to be about 1/4 of an inch, but it'll be curved on the inside and curved on the outside. And one of the things that will happen is you'll wind up with a little bit of a fuzzy edge along here, but that cleans up nicely with a little bit of sandpaper. Now, I don't know what's showing up on your screen, but when I'm turning here, in this area right here where my chisel is, I cannot see the wood. I see a gray fuzzy area there. So I have to look at the horizon, and I can see better what I'm doing by looking at the horizon. Now, how many of you looked at these things over here and figured out where I made my mistakes? Anybody? There are 2 of them over there where I made mistakes, and I compensated for them. Now, one of the challenges you have is to remember that this cavity, there's a hole there going down through the middle and goes down here someplace. And so the question you've got to ask yourself, well, how far down does it go? If you guess right and you go down far enough, you'll have a nice long tail out here. If you guess wrong and you cut into that, then you get a bobtail pendant like this one over here. So this middle one here, it looks all right, but it doesn't have a tail on it because I cut in too quick. That make sense? But the key here is to learn how to compensate for that and make something salvageable out of it anyway. Now, if I hadn't told you I made a mistake on it, you'd probably thought I made it that way. So it gets back to the idea that you don't tell your people where your mistakes are, because if they don't see them, they don't exist. Okay, now another thing, you need to figure out how you want to finish off this tail down here. I have a tendency to put a little bit of a knob down there of some sort. It makes it look a little bit better than just straight taper down. You figure out what you want to do, and you do what you want. How many of you have taken a course? I didn't do it. How many of you have taken a course in making fiddles? Very many? Okay, I took a course from Cindy Drozda a few years ago, and she taught us quite a bit. What's that?
Cindy's actually doing a virtual course on that coming up shortly. It's part of the AEW.
Cindy's a good instructor. I've had several courses from her. So anyway, you figure out how you want this thing to look like down here. And you got to get this in pretty well finished. Maybe not completely, but close. Because when you go back up here, and we start cutting this down, it gets real thin. It doesn't have the strength to do all this heavy work that we just got through doing. Any questions so far? Okay, let's stop and look and see what we've got up here in the way of cross section. Well, it's not too bad down there. It'd be ready for sanding if we wanted to. Okay, we're going to start smoothing this down here. I'm going to go back to bowl gouge because I can use a planing cut across there and make a real smooth cut, and I can control it very well. This is the same type of cut that you can make with a skew if you're real careful. My lathe at home has a bar across there that I can bump with my knee. Now this has a chip out right here. Can you see that? Now we might be able to smooth that out a little bit with taking that corner down a little bit. Now, sometimes when you're watching the horizon, you don't have enough contrast. Just about got it. You may put a different piece of cardboard or something over here, a different color. Makes it easier for you to see. Okay, now, at this point, I want to start curving this thing down. So we'll start curving that down a little bit. You can stop frequently and see how things are going. Now, has anybody picked up on the mistakes that I made? Nobody? I don't have enough room to finish off this top, do I? Well, it kind of got myself in a tight spot. Now luckily on this one, I've got a way out. I'm going to go back down here and try to work a little bit more on this end, because I can. It's a little bit sharper tool. I've got that thin enough that I can finish that up without too much trouble. Anybody got any ideas of how I'm going to get past this problem? Yeah, let's move it out. Because I don't have a dovetail in there. It's just a straight tenon, so I'm just going to loosen it up a little bit and slide it out about there. What's that?
Could go back to turning between centers.
I might be able to, but I don't have much confidence in that. What's that?
You have to have a really light touch.
Yeah. One of the tricks I've got here, remember I talked about this thing doing a real fine finish because it's got that concave in it? I'm going to take this and I'm going to cut in there and get as much of it as I can. I may have to finish it up on a belt sander when I get finished. Real light cuts. This is where left-handed turning comes in. I saw a bright red flash over there someplace. What was it? Somebody's making sure I was awake. So now I've got something there that looks reasonable. It's going to take a little bit of trimming when I get through with Now, if you remember, you want to make your, I don't have a saw with me, I'll use that, but you want to have the separation point far enough out that when it splinters, the splinters don't go back into the wood you want to keep. And the same thing over here.
John, we have a question.
So do you loosen up that step center as you're narrowing that tip down there?
Say again?
Ask on the mic. Thank you.
Do you loosen up that step center when you're finishing that tip there?
I do at home. I didn't think of it here.
Okay.
I also, at this point, I didn't bring my saw with me, but I've got a fine tooth saw at home. I've got a saw. I don't know if it's fine tooth enough, but there's a saw right there. And at this point, we step over to our belt sander or disc sander and fine tune it a little bit. There we go. Leatherman wins again. Any questions?
Can you hold that up?
What's that? Now that at home I would have sanded that while it was still on the lathe before I took it off. It looks similar to what we had over there, not exactly the same. Way brave to hold this one up. I like the shape of this one better than this one, as far as the shape of the cavities. See that? Questions, comments?
Do you have a favorite wood to turn?
Question was, do you have a favorite wood to turn?
I don't like pine and fir. These guys here, when I was working with these, this one in particular, I just grabbed some fir because I was trying to get that 120 degrees set up right. So I was just using a 2x6 and cutting them on my table saw. So I had some 2x6 pieces. I glued the thing up and used it. The problem with the fir is it chips. It chips out real bad. But this apple I liked a lot better. So I like the fruit woods. I don't really have any that I don't like.
Hello.
I just don't care much for the pine and fir because they just don't have the right texture and finish to them.
One more question. Bob, can you grab that sphere that you were just looking at? And can you show that to everyone and talk about that, John, a little bit? On what and how you made that? Because that's an inside out, I assume.
That's inside out.
Yep.
A lot of people look at spheres as being very difficult to do. if you're careful, are not that difficult. That was an inside-out turning, yes. I'm going to set these up here so you can look at them. Or you want to pass them around? Just pass them around here. Your clearance. Okay, that sphere, this is good timing. This is four segments. That one is 3. It was about this big. So I just played around with it, and I cut into that and made a cavity, and then I made a couple of side pieces so that it would be an interesting, not just a round hole. Okay. Then turned it around. And then turned it into a cylinder, cut it the length of it, the same length as the diameter, and then started rounding it off. Now, the key to making a sphere like that,
Maybe you can grab it and you can put it under the camera too, the sphere.
well, under which camera? That help? The key to doing a sphere, I don't have a small thing with me, but if you think of a piece of pipe, it's a cylinder, right? If you take a piece of pipe and put it up against a tennis ball, it's going to make a complete ring around there in one place. It's going to be straight, right? Well, so that piece of pipe that you put up there makes a good sanding block. Because what happens is you put that pipe up there and put this between the centers, and the pipe is going to apply pressure only on the high spots. So what I made when I was doing this, I made a cup center here and a cup center here, so I could take the ball and hold it between the cup centers, and using a piece of, well, here, this works. That's a cylinder. It makes contact in one line all the way around. So if you have a piece of sandpaper and you put between this and this, it's going to be hitting on the high spots. So as you go around this thing, it's going to sand off the high spots. And then when you get through, you've got nothing with high spots on it. They're all the same height. So that makes it a lot easier to sand and makes it simpler to make. That answer your question, Raleigh? Yep. Yes. I'm glad you saw this.
Glad you saw it, yes. Nice job, John.
Matter of fact, if you look at this thing, the centers that I made when I was playing with this the other night, I just had 2 bare pieces of wood, and when it made contact, that's what happened here, it burned it. I had to back off and put a piece of abrasive foam on each one to get a little bit more friction so that it would hold it without spinning. Other questions? It's a fun project. You can make something as simple or as complex as you want. And when I made this, or let's go back a little bit. When I made this a couple of years ago and I was playing around with these things, I was just wanting to see how it would work. Took a piece of wood, make some cuts into it, flipped it over, glued it back together, and started turning. I made this. This piece up here, 4 segments, I made that. Let's see, what are the other old ones? Here's one that I've played around with. So I just played around with it, get an idea of what's possible, what works, what doesn't work. Another thing you can do, when I was playing around with it a month or so ago, I made this outer piece and I put a little piece in the middle, And the top of it, I didn't like. I didn't like it at all. Just a dome across there. So this was sitting into a 1-inch recess. So I put it in the chuck and I drilled a 1/2-inch hole at the top with the idea of putting some sort of a finial on here. And this is my first attempt. I put that on there, and I didn't like the looks of it. So I took that off. I made another attempt. I make that guy. I put that on there, and I didn't like the looks of it. So then I made another one, and that one looked good enough. I glued it in place. So experiment. That's the fun of it. Experiment. Now, these are pieces that I cut on my table saw, and that turned out to be a piece of apple that was that long and probably that big a diameter, or half section. And this is what I wound up cutting out of it. I cut it into a bunch of slabs first on the bandsaw, and then ran that through. I didn't do it. Anyway, I ran that through and a planer, got it flat, then went back and cut the 360s. Now this is too long for the projects I do, so I'll cut this in half when I start making some of these other things. I like the apple. I like, let's see, those are maple. So we've got apple, maple. Most of the hardwoods get along real well. Does that mean I'm out of time?
Yeah. We have any more questions? If not, we'll give him a round of applause and wrap it up for the evening since we have noise.